inimitable Harry Breidahl from Nautilus Education in Victoria. Jazz works at the intersection of science and technology, governance, policy and international diplomacy. She is co-leading a national dialogue for the UN Ocean Decade 2021 to 2030, seeking inclusivity of all Australian oceans with a focus on impact and measurement. Jazz worked in higher education for over 2 decades in senior leadership roles, and within government she was the Australian representative to the UNESCO Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission and developed the global and national partnership framework for the Bureau of Meteorology. She serves as Secretary to Science and Technology Australia and Chair of the Sydney Institute for Marine Science Foundation. Harry is even older than me. I can get away with that one. Thank you, El Presidente. Harry was a founding member of A Squared E Squared and also MESA. You may remember that wonderful organisation, the Marine Education Society of Australasia. Harry was a presenter at the first A Squared E Squared conference in Arbury Park in 1980. Typo. It was a typo, Harry. Since 1974, he worked as a teacher, a university lecturer, and a freelance consultant. He's contributed to many voluntary marine and environmental groups and authored over 100 books and other publications. In particular, Harry has become a leader in marine education, both nationally and internationally. Although retired at a very young age, he is still actively promoting ocean literacy, most recently as part of the IOC UNESCO group, aiming to focus global attention on catalysing ocean sustainability as part of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And a bit of a hero of mine, Jasmine Chambers and Harry Breidahl. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity and the wonderful welcome. My name is Jazz Chambers and I'm one of the founders of Ocean Decade Australia, an initiative connecting Australia's ocean stakeholders. I'm speaking from the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to them and to the traditional custodians of other lands from wherever you are joining us today. I'm grateful for their custodianship of country, land and sea, and the deep and ancient understanding of the connectedness between all things.
And my name's Harry Breidahl. I first joined AAEE in 1980, so that was over 50 years ago. And it's an honour to be making this keynote presentation with Jazz. I'm speaking from the traditional lands of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners, and I would also like to pay my respects to the Boonwurrung elders past, present and emerging, and to the elders of other communities who may be taking part in this conference today.
Thanks, Harry. Today we're here to talk to you about the United Nations Ocean Decade and ocean literacy. I'm delighted that I had the good fortune to meet Harry earlier this year, and obviously amongst this community he's very well known. We've become collaborators in a short amount of time, such as the force of nature that is our ocean and also Harry. So what is the Ocean Decade? The history of the decade goes back many years. You may be aware that the United Nations declares decades on topics of global importance, and there are 9 international decades currently being observed by the United Nations. In 2017, the UN declared 2021 to 2030 the decade of ocean science for sustainable development, with a vision to deliver the science we need for the ocean that we want. At Ocean Decade Australia, we view the decade as a platform opportunity where we should be able to bring people together to collaborate, partner, learn and act for a sustainable ocean future. From 2018 to 2020, this is a bit of a lot of information on a slide, but it sums up about a year and a half, almost 2 years of amazing collaboration and work between ocean practitioners, educators, scientists, policymakers and leaders, including the likes of Harry, who came together to develop this action framework. The framework identified 10 ocean challenges, 3 high-level objectives, which you can see primarily focus on knowledge, and then there was this concept of, the ocean that we want, and 7 decade outcomes: a clean, healthy and resilient, productive, predicted safe, accessible, and inspiring and engaging ocean. I don't think any of us can argue with that. And the idea behind the framework is that it should take us from the ocean that we have to the ocean that we want. It provides a roadmap and mechanisms for contributions from all ocean stakeholders to be counted towards a global effort. And indeed, anyone can be a contributor. Down here are the types of decade actions that have been defined as programs, projects, activities, and contributions. The framework doesn't set targets or make nations make commitments, but it is this idea of a map, a roadmap towards the ocean that we want. A recently published report from UNESCO, Ocean Decade Coordination Unit, outlines ocean literacy's part to play in this. And I know that Harry was heavily involved in working towards this. And as you can see, without ocean literacy, which is represented by these lovely turquoise bubbles, we don't get very far on any aspect of the framework. It really drives the objectives, as mentioned. They're about knowledge and is key to understanding the challenges. And ocean literacy is ubiquitous, like the ocean itself. Ultimately, it is an outcome in itself. So why the ocean? Many of you will know the centrality of ocean to life on Earth. Without it being healthy, we've got no hope of being healthy humans. It covers over 70% of the planet's surface, and it houses more biodiversity than on land. It is the lungs of the planet and produces half the oxygen on Earth, and is the largest absorber and sequester of carbon. And
it regulates weather and climate. It is a vital source of food and protein for almost 3 billion people. And the global blue economy is estimated at $3 trillion and about 200 million jobs. And so our future is inexorably linked to the ocean. And yet, we have no systematic approach to ocean education in Australia. And this is a really profound statement, because Australia does have a proud history of achievements in marine education going back at least 4 decades. In that sense, I believe that marine education in Australia has been through the first 3 stages of the adaptive cycle, and we are now poised to enter the 4th stage, where ocean literacy and the UN Ocean Decade provide us with the foundation for the development of new and novel approaches. Jas has already briefly outlined the UN Ocean Decade, but just what is this thing called ocean literacy? Almost 20 years ago, our USA-based colleagues decided to address the issues of a lack of a systematic approach to ocean education in their nation. And they did so over a 10-year period from 2002 to 2012. And they did it in a very collaborative and involved way. And there was no institutional ownership. Most of the work was done online. And the process resulted in the definition of ocean literacy, followed by the identification of 7 essential principles that were supported by a number of fundamental concepts. Full details can be found in the ocean literacy brochure that should be available at this conference, or via the website at the bottom here. And also, I'll also be saying a little bit more at a presentation on Thursday afternoon. But by 2004, this new way of thinking had resulted in the creation of the concept of ocean literacy with the following definition, and I love it. Ocean literacy is an understanding of the ocean's influence on you and your influence on the ocean. The emphasis here in the definition is on the personal element of ocean literacy, and it is backed up by 3 additional personal elements. And so, an ocean literate person understands the essential principles and fundamental concepts about the ocean, can communicate about the ocean in a meaningful way, and is able to make informed and responsible decisions regarding the ocean and its resources. These 3 elements are based on an understanding of the ocean as a way of achieving informed decision-making, and that's really important. The next step was to establish these 7 essential principles, and there was a lot of debate backwards and forwards about the wording of these 7 principles, and it was mainly done online. But the first one is the Earth has one big ocean with many features. The ocean and life in the ocean shape the features of Earth. Third is the ocean is a major influence on weather and climate. The ocean makes the Earth habitable. The ocean supports a great diversity of life and ecosystems. The ocean and humans are inextricably connected. And number 7, my favourite, the ocean is largely unexplored. Each of these essential principles was supported by a number of fundamental concepts, and that was followed by scope and sequence guides being delivered for USA year levels K to 12. And you can find details of this again in the brochure or on the Ocean Literacy website. Most importantly, after all of this was done, the whole ocean literacy package has been accepted basically without change across the globe. And as part of this process, UNESCO IOC adopted ocean literacy and linked it to something I think most of you would be familiar with, and that's the UN Sustainable Development Goals, in particular, SDG 14, Life Below Water. The key element in this move was to take the original concept of ocean literacy and then add to it actions aimed at achieving a sustainable ocean. And following that redefinition of ocean literacy, UNESCO IOC held an international workshop in Venice in December 2019 to establish ocean literacy as the foundation of an educational response to the UN Ocean Decade. I represented AAEE at that workshop, and then as a member of a subsequent working group that produced a comprehensive decade-long framework for action for UNESCO member states. That framework for action is now available as a downloadable PDF. I didn't include the link here because it's about a mile long, but all you need to do is do a Google search and you'll find it. A key component of this UNESCO IOC framework for action involves 16 clearly expressed targets for UNESCO member states, each with specific time elements. And I just picked out 3. By 2025, 70% of member states have a national ocean literacy strategy. That'll be good here in Australia. By 2025, schools across the world have access to high quality ocean literacy education resources. And by 2030, 70% of formal educators receive training and tools to incorporate ocean literacy in their classroom. The important thing to note here is that although the UN Decade itself doesn't set targets, this framework does, and Australia is a UNESCO member state. So now I'll hand back to Jazz to say a little bit more about the Ocean Decade and Ocean Decade Australia.
Thanks, Harry. I'll talk a little bit about the provenance of the Ocean Decade here. It is being led by a part of UNESCO called the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. So we're referring to UNESCO IOC, sometimes referred to as IOC UNESCO, but we just call it IOC for short. The IOC is the United Nations body responsible for supporting global ocean science and services. And as Harry mentioned, Australia is one of the 150 member states that work together to protect the health of our shared ocean. And we coordinate programs in areas such as ocean observations, tsunami warnings, and marine spatial planning. It was established in 1960, and since then it's provided a focus for all UN bodies, and there are many, there are dozens and dozens of United Nations bodies that have an interest in the ocean. So anyone, any group working to understand, improve the management of oceans, coasts and marine ecosystems, UNESCO IOC is the focal point. For a period, I was the Australian representative to the IOC, and I attended formal meetings, and there's a picture up here that I took at one of those meetings, just when we got started talking about the decade planning. I must admit, when I was telling Harry the story the other day, when they first said to me, oh, you're going to be the IOC representative for Australia, I actually thought they were talking about the International Olympic Committee, and I did think to myself, I'm the least qualified person to do that. But thankfully, it was about the ocean. It's the IOC that has the responsibility as Secretariat for the Ocean Decade, and they're coordinating many thousands of people across the globe to provide guidance for the decade and coordinate outputs such as the ones that we've talked about, so frameworks, documents and guidance. And this is a picture down here of one of the first planning meetings. They ran lots of these throughout 2019 and 2020 to essentially land on a framework and the documents behind that. They're lengthy documents, but they're all available if you want to go and read them. The IOC and the Ocean Decade Advisory Board oversee the endorsement of actions from nations that submit them. So I mentioned actions earlier, programs, projects, actions and contributions, and anyone can put forward an action, individuals, groups, coalitions of organisations on particular areas, and then it'll be assessed as to whether or not it ticks off aspects of the framework. In Australia, we have 4 Australian-led actions that have been submitted from the Minderoo Foundation and approved, the Great Barrier Reef Foundation and Piping Hot Australia, which is a fashion brand. So truly anyone can put forward actions. And you can find out more about those on the Ocean Decade Australia website. It's important to mention also this high-level panel, this logo down here that I've got, high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, because it's another major initiative that Australia is involved in. And we're a member of this panel with 15 other nations. And our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, sits on it with leaders from Canada, Palau, Fiji, and others. And as I mentioned earlier, the decade doesn't require nations to make commitments. It sort of is a roadmap towards action. But we actually have made commitments on this sustainable panel here, this ocean panel. Key amongst them is the commitment to deliver a sustainable ocean plan by 2025. And that's a significant commitment. Through our work at Ocean Decade Australia, we wish to ensure that such a plan is representative of the great diversity of Australia's ocean stakeholders. And that's a nice segue into talking about what it is that we've been doing. So we began earlier this year, and when we did, my collaborators and I essentially wanted to include stakeholders in a discussion about the ocean that went beyond the important but obvious stakeholders in government and research. And what we have found is that Australia's ocean stakeholders are very many, very varied, and actually pretty fragmented. In the course of our work, we discovered that we were in fact pulling together and connecting ocean stakeholders. And there are many mechanisms that do that and many organisations that do those sorts of things, often though not necessarily across stakeholders. So identifying stakeholders, this list, for example, that's up here on the screen, that wasn't available earlier this year. There was no sort of written down list. And you can see down here, we have a caveat. We never stop adding to the list. So if there is a stakeholder group missing from this, we would love to hear from you. We have built this list by just taking in information from others, and it's messy and incomplete, but we're comfortable with the messiness of it as we are still in consultation phase. But as you can see, there would be many and varied ways to categorise or group stakeholders. So if you talk about, for example, I'll use ocean energy as an idea, you would be including science and research, government, ocean-based business. There'd be community groups that you'd want to talk to, traditional owners, and then investors for certain. So it's not a simple list. It's really around that ecosystem of stakeholders. If there's one learning I could share with you, though, it's at the beginning of a process like this. If you've got a question, even if it seems simple and obvious, just keep asking more people about it, because that's how we started this dialogue, by asking what we thought were fairly simple questions. What does success look like for the Ocean Decade in Australia, and how will we measure it? And I realise I'm speaking to a room full of educators, so it's no revelation that asking questions is a good idea, but we've just persisted in asking, and we've been fairly amazed with what's unfolded. The more we asked this question of different groups, we realised there was a very real appetite to answer it and to have those answers written down. And what we found is that those responses have converged into fairly consistent themes across stakeholders. There wasn't just one answer, and the answers actually might mean quite different things to different groups, but this is what we've heard, and they do coalesce around these 4 themes. Heard a lot from people. It's probably up there with one of the key ones is this idea of value of the ocean and marine ecosystems, that people want that to be understood and for the human impact on them to be accounted for. And if I take you back to that definition of ocean literacy that Harry mentioned earlier, the understanding of the ocean's influence on you and your influence on the ocean, we can start to see that this idea of value really does require that two-way understanding. If you're not aware of it, Australia is engaged in a process around environmental economic accounting, and quite a lot of money has been put into that to actually figure out how to account for nature. I'm sure many of you are aware of that, and ocean accounting is certainly a big part of the conversation. We also heard that governance was important, and this should result in policy that reflects that understanding of ocean value. This naturally leads to a response around integration, and we think that this idea of an integrated ocean management plan really speaks to the current ocean user and ocean stakeholder experience, because a lot of things are not necessarily integrated. So I'll give some examples that we've heard about. A community group who wishes to improve the health of a local lagoon, actually just figuring out which jurisdiction applies, a local council, the state government, or a federal agency that's responsible, can be confusing and exhausting. As another example, how do we ensure that there is clear communication between ocean users in the same space at the same time? So a massive fishing fleet that goes out into fishing waters, and an oil and gas exploration company and a cruise liner all there at the same time. So at present, there would be no necessarily obvious place where each of those would go to find out who was doing what. Use is just one aspect of integration. We also heard that people wish for use of space to be equitable and to ensure sustainability for generations to come, and to embed traditional knowledge and practice. And these are important dimensions for any integrated plan to consider as well. Finally, people want action. We can run a lot of talk fests on these topics, but what actions do we need to take and when? And so we've spent quite a bit of time trying to make sure that we're bringing action into the conversation and demonstrating action. When you look at what it says here, an execution of a national community education action campaign to drive ocean literacy, and you take yourself to examples of campaigns like that, like Keep Australia Beautiful or Slip Slop Slap. You know, these are simple messages, but behind campaigns like that is a lot of research, a lot of investment, and the will. And so trying to build towards that is important. So as I say, from simple questions, when you unpack the answers, and despite the convergence around those themes, the actual outputs and impact of these ideas of success can mean quite different things to a science teacher, a shipping CEO, the head buyer of seafood at a major supermarket chain, and a surfer. So what are we doing about this? I've been working with 2 extraordinary people who have given their time, energy, connections and knowledge to this initiative, Kim Picard and Karen Evans, and I speak on behalf of the 3 of us. You can read more about all of us on the website. And what we feel we're doing is basically focusing our efforts on connecting Australia's ocean stakeholders through building the stage for people to share their stories. We're hosting events and meetings. Our next large event for 2021 is planned for October 26, which I invite you to attend. We're talking about behaviour and action for a sustainable ocean future. We've traversed what success looks like and how some stakeholders think we might measure it, and we're now talking about encouraging and displaying particular behaviours. I've personally conducted over 250 interviews for most sectors of the economy and many industries over the past 7 months. And that's been incredibly enriching and very varied in terms of the conversation, each ending actually with an acknowledgement that we're all ocean stakeholders and that no one's saying that we're doing an optimal job, that there's not a problem. Everyone, I think, acknowledges that we could all do better. How and when we use our collective influence, resources and talents to move the dial is key to our future success. We've conducted a lot of surveys and currently have another in train around attitudes, priorities and recommendations. And in our last briefing, we sought to ensure that Australians were aware of these 3 nationally led initiatives for the ocean. You can find out more on the website, but there are 3 big initiatives outside of the Ocean Decade with plans, strategies and so forth around them, including that panel that I mentioned earlier. And there is a need to integrate their findings to move the dial. Importantly, and finally, on this slide, we've really seen the decade conversation as an opportunity to build a culture of what we call radical inclusivity and to welcome diverse input and feedback. If we don't include everyone in this conversation, and by that I mean fisheries, oil and gas, science, education, artists, Indigenous and First Nations perspectives, then we don't have a real conversation about the ocean and how to ensure its sustainability. So all perspectives are important because no one owns the ocean. We all are just stakeholders and beneficiaries of it. We're providing information and resources that help Australians understand the Ocean Decade framework and the process of endorsement of actions. And we know that we've seeded partnerships and contracts have resulted because of introductions. We've got people telling us that that's happening, which is incredibly heartening to hear. Indeed, I would not be talking to you today if not for Harry being a proactive and generous supporter of the Decade and Ocean Decade Australia and inviting me to take part in this conference and to connect with all of you. I do want to emphasise that this is an entirely voluntary initiative. Everyone who's been involved as a speaker, a facilitator, a venue host, data cruncher, event organiser, they've all volunteered their time, and we've got to thank the incredible range of contributors to the efforts to date. But I think it's just one of those great lessons that if you build the stage, generosity will flow. So how do you, our educators, some of our most important contributors to ensuring ocean literacy proliferates for future generations, become part of this picture? I hope that you can see how imperative ocean literacy is upon those ideas of success that Australians have told us about. Indeed, ocean literacy is the very foundation on which we can build an understanding of the ocean's value, the opportunity for good governance and an ecosystem for strong policy and integrated plans for action. Harry.
Although this has been a relatively brief presentation, I hope that Jazz and I have been able to establish a clear role for Australian educators within the broad context of the UN Ocean Decade. Going back to the adaptive cycle, I believe that the decade provides us with the opportunity to develop a new and novel approach where ocean literacy is the key to achieving the decade outcome of the ocean we want. During my concurrent session on Thursday afternoon, I'll cover a few possible approaches to the challenges, but would like to close by emphasising that the 16 targets in the UNESCO IOC framework for action and the ability of our nation to achieve these targets by 2025 and 2030 and provide the ocean we want for future generations is very much in your hands. So thank you all.
We would like to leave you with this phrase from one of the Ocean Panel reports because I think we both agree it sums up this concept of ocean literacy and the relationship between humans and the ocean so well, and also really resonates with what we've heard from Australia's ocean stakeholders, and I'll just quickly read it. This approach does not mean just leaving the ocean alone. It means proactively managing human activities to use the ocean wisely rather than using it up, in order to help build a much richer future in which people have more wealth and better health, nature thrives and resources are distributed more equitably. How we do this with the education community that you represent is a question we put to you as experts and knowledge holders, and I wish you an excellent conference for the next few days.
Yes, I wish I was there too. I was booked to come, but being Victorian, I couldn't make it. Jazz and my contact details are there. And thank you for your valuable time today. Cheers.
Thank you.